Hey guys, I'm Mike Carlson,
And I'm Brian Hasenbottle.
and welcome to the View from the U. Brian, why don't you get us started?
All right, Mike. So anyone who's seen the show has to know how big a fan you are of Jameis Winston. What they don't know is that I also have a little man crush on a football player from Auburn University, running back Trey Mason. Now this guy has just been a stud all season. I mean, Auburn's offense is really the reason that they're winning so much right now. And Trey Mason, he got 4 touchdowns against Arkansas. You can look at the numbers; he's doing really well, and he's really just pulling. He's really helping pull this team to victories because they don't really have the quarterback power that like Alabama has or LSU or Texas A&M, but they're really just winning games, and it's because of the run game, and I think Trey Mason's a big part of that. I mean, you can look at the stats for yourself. This guy's doing a great job, and while I'm sad he's not in Heisman contention, he is a junior, so we can hold out hope for next year. So, speaking of Heisman, Mike.
Okay, Brian, so I want to get us started. The Heisman race. I had Winston at the top of my rankings for the last couple of weeks. This week he is not at the top of my rankings because he beat Miami, that's the first thing you do is you want to get the win, but he didn't really do great while doing it. 1 touchdown to two interceptions. You don't want to see that. He made some great passes here and there, but my Florida State really won that game because of their great rushing attack. So right now, Brian, Marcus Mariota out of Oregon is the number one of my Heisman rankings. 29 total touchdowns, zero interceptions. And Brian, zero interceptions speaks for itself. When you turn the ball over, you hurt your team, and Mariota has hurt his team in maybe the most minimal amount that you could hurt your team, and I think that's really cool to see. And zero interceptions, you don't really see that in college football. You really see that more in a Madden kind of a situation where you're perfect there, and you have that opportunity to restart if you're playing bad. So I really like him, and Winston he's fallen down. He's number 2 in my rankings right now just because he didn't play up to Jameis Winston. We've been spoiled, Brian, really, with Jameis Winston.
Yeah.
We expect 5 touchdowns, no interceptions, and 300 yards, 400 yards passing each week from him. So the lackluster performance against Miami is going to bump him down a spot. But I want to spotlight Johnny Manziel. He's starting to reappear in that Heisman race. Has 2 losses. I don't think he has enough time to necessarily make a push because he will not have an SEC championship game. He won't have that extra game to add to his body of work. But I think he's going to kind of creep back up into the race. But right now, it's a 2-horse race, Brian. It's Marcus Mariota and Jameis Winston, and it's going to be like that. I mean, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. I mean, Manziel, at one point in the season, after they lost to Auburn, I think the only thing this guy can really do to get back in there is to, in every game of the season, 400 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, and bring back 3 people from the dead.
Yeah.
But but seeing as that hasn't happened, he still has played well, and when you look at the rankings, he's still up there ahead of your guy Bryce Petty.
Yeah, I don't think Bryce Petty has the national attention to kind of get that. He doesn't have that kind of that X factor, that national attention that his Heisman winning counterpart Robert Griffin III did. I mean, Robert Griffin III kind of achieved a godlike status. I mean, kind of halfway through the season. I mean, he became the most interesting man in college football. And where Petty has those stats that RG3 has, I don't think he necessarily has that. Excuse me. He doesn't necessarily have that godlike stat. He doesn't have that aura about him where people see him and they're like, that guy's Mr. Football right there. So I think he's penalized partially in part because he just doesn't have that spotlight that is associated with your Texas A&Ms, your Florida States, or your Oregons. So it's sad to see a guy get penalized because of that, but right now, I mean, you have to look at Mariota, Jameis Winston, Johnny Manziel, and then finally to top out the top 4, Bryce Petty.
Yeah. So move on to the top 25. One team, I think I'm gonna have to talk about them every week because they keep going back and forth. Florida State. I do think they deserve to be number 2, and here's why. I mean, I said it before with the argument between Taj Boyd and between Taj Boyd and Jameis Winston for the Clemson game, and it's really the same with Florida State Oregon. You really can't compare Winston and Mariota because while Winston may have had one bad game, that doesn't mean that Mariota is that much of a better quarterback. It may have implications in a Heisman race, but it shouldn't for the standings. And I do believe that Florida State is a better all-around team. Like I would much rather have the Florida State defense to the Oregon defense any day of the week. And while they may not have some of the speed that Oregon is just known far and wide over the hills and under the valleys for, I still think they are a much better. And they're a bit of a tougher football team. So, moving on, Mike, I haven't said this on the air, but I've said this to you. I was never a supporter of Oklahoma State in the top 25 from the beginning.
You've repeatedly, I get texted late at the night with you ranting about Oklahoma State. So continue.
Yeah, and I do have to take back some of the things I said. I did completely throw them off after that loss to West Virginia, but turns out it was just one of those upsets that happened because they really came out and they performed big against a Texas Tech team that I've been a huge supporter of this whole season. So I do think I now firmly believe in here that they deserve their spot in their top 25. But two teams who do not deserve a spot in the top 25, or at least not at the ranks they are, Fresno State and Northern Illinois. Another thing I tell you, Mike, I'm not a big supporter of small conference teams, and here's the reason why. Fresno State, the Mountain West is sort of an in-between conference. There's surely no ACC, SEC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, any type of division like that. They do occasionally produce some good teams, and when I'm watching Fresno State, I don't see like the spark or like the offensive and defensive superiority that was present in like a Boise State team in 2008 when they could go to the Fiesta Bowl and beat a really good team like Oklahoma from a much bigger conference. And Northern Illinois, I think Northern Illinois is a different story because that is based on Jordan Lynch. Let's face it, he's a great quarterback, but the reason I don't think they belong in the top 25 is because Jordan, and how I see Northern Illinois. So if we put these like cars, for example, we see any SEC team. Let's take Alabama, put it as a nice red Ferrari with a big engine, something very fast that can get you from A to B very quickly. Now, Northern Illinois, they're a smaller conference team, so let's consider them a Volkswagen Beetle, but Jordan Lynch is that Ferrari engine. They don't have the traction in the tires. They don't have the, they don't have the fuel tank. They don't have a lot of the other keys that a team like Alabama has. Or I guess Alabama is a bit of a reach given the current rank of this team. But you get what I mean. There's really only one huge top 10, top 20 element of this team.
Yeah, I definitely get what you mean. But I gotta say, I like Northern Illinois. I rooted for them last year. They were in a BCS bowl. I'm kind of in a whole down with the BCS. Kind of a mood these last couple years where I think that these small conference teams should kind of show the BCS who's boss. So I like Northern Illinois. I like Jordan Lynch, but with the way the atmosphere that college football's in right now, where you have Alabama, Florida State, Oregon, Stanford, and Baylor all on a collision course, I kind of would like them to take more of a back seat this year because you have those 5 teams right now that are just on a collision course for who knows where, and someone's going to get hurt. I think some schools are going to get their feelings hurt when it comes down to the BCS. But I kind of like Northern Illinois. I like Jordan Lynch, but this year I would kind of like it to see them take more of a backseat because you got so many great games lined up for bowl season.
Yeah, and I'm not saying they're not not anywhere in the same neighborhood. I do believe that these teams could be in like the 20 to the 25 to 20 range, but really not further than that because then you're getting into dangerous territory because with the current rankings you're implying that Northern Illinois could beat a team like Wisconsin, which I would not put money on. But beside that, moving on, Arizona State, I asked for it last year and the BCS appeased me. They put them in the top 25. I have a few more requests if you're willing to listen, but I do believe that this is a proper place for them. This is one of the teams where they're unstoppable at home and they can carry momentum onto the road. And they may have. And I said it last week. They may have some losses to some very good teams, but they still are. Way up there in my mind, and I think their ability level is way up there in the BCS too. So, all right, BCS. Here are my requests for next week. Here's what I'm hoping you'll put in next week. All right. First team is University of Minnesota. This team has a football program that nobody really turns an eye to. They're in a big conference, but they're sort of are that backseat team, sort of like Vanderbilt is in the SEC. But they're really coming out. They're really playing very well, and I didn't really expect them to get in this week after a very close game against what I think is a really good Indiana team. But make no mistake, these guys are doing really well, and it's not like their wins have been just like fluke games. They played well, and that's why they beat Nebraska. They played well, that's why they beat Northwestern. They played well, that's why they beat Indiana. And these guys are consistent, and they really do deserve more recognition. And then the other one is Texas. They really did. They're sort of like Arizona State. They did get booted out after a few early losses, but they showed their strength against Oklahoma. Make no mistake. They're really sort of on the waiting list. One thing I like to do is look at the AP top 25 because they also have sort of like a waiting list, like teams that are close. And often you see teams like I saw Ball State on there last week, but I've seen Texas on there for a few weeks now, and I do believe they should be in the top 25, especially since some of the teams are very, very kind of shaky. So, that being on, Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you for your call on Florida State and Miami.
Okay, Brian, I was really hoping for an earth-shattering game where Jameis Winston throws for 6 touchdowns, the bottom of the earth opens up, the BCS falls through, we have a playoff in college sports, and Jameis Winston wins the Heisman and is the first-round pick in the next, not this year's draft, but the following year. But that wasn't the case, Brian. It was all but the Jameis Winston show, really. He tallied only 1 touchdown to 2 interceptions, which, in my opinion, is kind of it's lackluster. If you're a Heisman candidate, you gotta put up those huge numbers. You gotta throw for 3 touchdowns and maybe have 1 interception, or 2 touchdowns and no interceptions, and have a very great game with your completion percentage. But that wasn't the case. The focus of this game, Brian, was on the rushing attack. Florida State tallied 4 rushing touchdowns against the Miami defense that looked 2 or 3 steps behind Jameis Winston and company. They couldn't seem to figure out what was going on. They definitely game planned for Winston as the 2 interceptions, I think. Excuse me, my eyes are getting dry. Reflected it. I think that they just didn't prepare for that running attack that Florida State has, and Florida State has a very good running attack. I saw the runners for these Florida State teams run, and they show that they're a great running football team, and I would definitely throw them up there with Alabama in terms of teams that have great running in terms of teams that have great rushing attacks. So Miami, I would actually argue that Stephen Morris outplayed Jameis Winston, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, only because he threw for 1 extra touchdown. But the scoreboard definitely reflected that Florida State owns this Miami team in all facets of the game. I mean, 41-14, it doesn't get worse than that, Brian. I mean, especially I was looking forward to a game that was either going to be a shootout or a defensive battle with Winston or Morris leading their team down the field with 2 minutes to go, down by a touchdown. But that just wasn't the case. This Florida State team, Brian, is a team to be reckoned with from now on. I think that their huge win against Clemson showed it, and I think that this huge win against Florida State or against Miami shows it, just because they blew out 2 top 10 teams, and I think the only other group that could say that would probably be Alabama. I mean, you look at Oregon; they haven't played great opponents. They've played UCLA. You could probably argue that that's their best opponent. They are going to play Stanford, which Stanford will push them to the limit, but they haven't played and dominated 2 top 10 teams like Florida State can. So in short, Brian, I see a Florida State team that's going to challenge Alabama if they meet him in the BCS championship game. And I think either way, Nick Saban he's in a lose-lose position. I mean, on one end you get Jameis Winston, the prolific Jameis Winston, and the very well-rounded Florida State. But on the other end, you get the chaotic spread option Oregon attack. So I think if you're Nick Saban, you got a lot of tape to watch these next couple weeks. Plus, you got to deal with Auburn. They're right on Alabama's tail too. So I think this year I'm gonna go ahead and make a guarantee, Brian. I guarantee you Alabama does not win a national championship this year. There are too many good teams out there, and Nick Saban is just gonna have too much on his plate this year, I think. So I'll turn it over to you right now.
Yeah, and just keep it, just stay on for a little bit. It's get a little bit of back and forth on this. I mean, what you're saying is, I mean, you look at the score of this game, and I was following it, but I imagine wouldn't you think, oh yeah, Jameis Winston, 400 yards, 5 touchdowns and all. But it really wasn't that. If you want to look at little victories for Miami, is they found a way, and they effectively sort of shut him down. But that does sort of add to my reason why I think Florida State deserves the number 2 spot, is because he may have had a bit of a lackluster game, but they still just smashed a very potent and highly regarded BCS ranked team.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, Brian. I mean, when I was actually out to dinner with my family, so I was able to catch maybe the first quarter, went to dinner. In between dinner, I kind of caught the second and third quarter, and then I went to a movie afterwards. And when I got out of the movie theater, I looked at the score and I'm like 40. I saw 41-14, and I just thought to myself, "Wow, Winston just lit them up. Man, that's really awesome to see." And then finally today, I went back and I took a look at the stats, and I saw 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions from Winston. So it definitely shows you that you have to have a very balanced game plan. You have to kind of give a little to Winston and take a little. You have to do. I'm trying to say you have to find that give and take against Florida, because if you only concentrate on Winston, then you have to deal with a very good rushing attack. But if you only concentrate on that rushing attack, Jameis Winston will scorch you down the field. So it's just an interesting thing to see going forward. But I think that with Oregon on their tail, Baylor on their tail, and you have Stanford on Alabama's tail, and then on top of all of that, Alabama has to game plan around the Iron Bowl, which will probably decide who will go to the SEC championship game.
Where you go?
I think Nick Saban just has too much on his plate. You're staring down the barrel of having to do tape on 3 or 4 really good college football teams while preparing for that week's current opponent, and then of course that huge game at Auburn in the Iron Bowl. So I think, Brian, there's too much on Saban's plate right now, and hopefully he'll show. Maybe he'll show this year that he's putting that $5.5 million to use, and maybe he'll lead Alabama to the national title.
Yeah, I mean, there's a quote from Cam Newton they said about the 2010 season when they won the national championship, is that Auburn's view on that is that they see the door and they're going to kick it down. Well, in this case, Nick Saban is behind the door, and you have Florida State, you have Oregon, you have Ohio State, you have Stanford, you have Baylor, you have Miami, you have all these teams who are kicking at it, and I mean. And all props to him. He's built another great program like he always does. I mean, that's characteristic of Nick Saban. But it really begs the question, how long can it last? And I think his time's run out.
And I definitely think his time's run out. I mean, and it's not like, Brian, that these are a lot of that he has to game plan around SEC teams, where you usually see in the SEC a very pro style type of attack. I mean, on one hand, you have to game plan around Florida State and their run and gun kind of attack, and then you have to game plan around Oregon's weird, chaotic track team off to the races. Let's put up 70 points this weekend kind of attack. And then you have to look at Ohio State and the fact that Ohio State has 2 athletes at quarterback in Braxton Miller and Kenny Guyton. And then you have to look at Baylor, who has a very similar attack to Oregon, but then again is still not the same as Oregon. So, and that all factors into configuring your defense and offensive attack for that game. And I just think that with all the different teams out there, all the different offenses, that Saban is just he's not going to be able to pull it all together when it matters the most. And I think that Alabama, I don't think they get the three-peat this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think they can definitely make it, but I mean, you really look at it. There's such an expectation there. Not only have they won their second consecutive national championship, but also they've been ranked number 1 throughout all of these weeks this season. While there's been jump around, between 2 through 25. There's probably been at least 2 or 3 teams in each position. But I mean, the expectations there, and they can't really keep going, steamrolling teams like Kentucky and Arkansas and Colorado State, and I'm not sure they'll get a quality opponent until the Iron Bowl, and that's either going to be sort of a that's either going to add to the belief that they are the number 1 team, or really bring them back to reality. And as an Auburn fan, I really do think that the Auburn offense they have there, that Gus Maslin's team, who I'm on the Gus bus, I'm a huge supporter, I'm all in. That his team is really potent. See if they can stop them.
Yeah, and one more thing, Brian, before I let you take on your game. I've been talking your ear off here. But I think that you bring up a great point. Alabama has yet to play a really strong opponent. They are going to play a great one. Not a great one, but a fair one in LSU this weekend, which will be the game that I'm covering. But I think that where Florida State has already had their mettle tested twice now with having to down 2 top 10 teams, I think they're a better conditioned team, and they're better to handle that spotlight. So now, on that note, I'm going to hand it off to you with your call on your game.
All right, well, it's funny. You hear us talking about all these big divisions, SEC, ACC, And this week I was in a division that I don't think will have very many BCS bowl participants other than Ohio State. I was in the Big Ten for two big games. First, which I'm going to cover, was Michigan versus Michigan State. Now, the rankings were very misleading for this because Michigan 21, Michigan State 22, you'd think naturally like, oh, it's going to be 14-14 going to double overtime and finish there, but it really wasn't that. Michigan State this season hasn't really had their chance in the top 25, even though I do believe that they're a very good team. I mean, watching it on TV, they kept talking about how Michigan State has the best defense in Division One, and they really showed that today. And looking at it, I saw this game. I saw it like a Canadian football game. There were so few third down conversions that at one point I was thinking, how about you save time on the clock and just punt it on third down? And that was a big problem, especially for Michigan, because they had repeated occurrences where they had 3rd and 20 plus, and they even had a 4th and 48, which you never want to put your punter in a situation where his best kick will get it 10 yards short of the first down line. And they were shooting themselves in the foot all game, and their offensive line was no match whatsoever for this Michigan State defensive attack. There were so many sacks, Devin Gardner had no time, and it was really just domination from that point. So on the flip side, you'd think that a Michigan State team like this, they'd be very potent in the offense, but their quarterback, Connor Cook, I don't see him as a top 25, Big Ten champion quarterback, because I was watching the game and he was making some critical errors. He was underthrowing, he was overthrowing, he was making some bad decisions in the pocket, and while that may work against a team where you have complete superiority over them when they have the ball, it probably won't work when you come up against Ohio State, which I do firmly believe that Ohio State and Michigan State are the two teams that need to play in the Big Ten championship. They've proven themselves to be the two best teams in this division, and I don't see anyone. I mean, maybe Wisconsin, they've had a good season, but they've lost to Ohio State, and just because of the way the divisions work out, that's the way it's going to be. And with Connor Cook and quarterback, I'm just not sure if the Michigan State defense can hold the very potent Ohio State offense who feeds off of Braxton Miller. If they can keep them quiet long enough to make all of Cook's errors not matter in the overall result of the game. So look at that in the future. The other game, it was a big rivalry game, Northwestern versus Nebraska. As a Northwestern fan, if any of you saw it, you have to know how heartbroken I am and how I did not want to talk about this game again. I mean, if you didn't see it, Northwestern had a 24-20 lead with 5 seconds left, and Nebraska won on a 50-yard Hail Mary on the last play of the game. Not something that you want to spend your Saturday doing, watching your team lose after they've owned most of the game. But Northwestern, I was really surprised because their offense has really been kind of struggling. And when you think of Nebraska, you think of the black shirts, the big defense, the big powerhouse there. And Northwestern, with their run game, walked all over them, and which you really wouldn't expect because Northwestern was on their 4th-string running back. They were on Trayvon Green, and the reason he was playing because Venrick Mark got hurt, Mike Trumpy got hurt, and Stephen Buckley got hurt at the beginning of the game, and yet he still got 100-plus yards. So, props to the Northwestern offensive line. They just created holes for most of the game. But the one thing that Nebraska did to counter this, they did more in the second half, was bring the blitz. When they did that, they couldn't run the ball. I mean, Coulter couldn't throw. He didn't have enough time. He got sacked a lot. And it really was the only case where I really saw this Nebraska defense showing themselves as superior to the Northwestern offense. And Northwestern, they run a 2-quarterback system with Kane Coulter and Trevor Siemian. And Siemian played a lot because the announcer said that Coulter was getting tired, but Siemian did not play a good game. I mean, he's a great quarterback. That day was just not his day. He threw a key pick 6 in the second half that tied it for Nebraska, while Kane Coulter was on the bench getting some rest after getting another first down, as he did for most of the game. And I do think that ended up hurting Northwestern. Granted, didn't have much of an effect on the Hail Mary at the end of the game, but nevertheless, it still, I believe, was a factor that led to it being such a close game as time ran out. So Nebraska, they really were impressive on their offense. Taylor Martinez was not playing again. Tarmy Armstrong Jr. was playing as quarterback, and I think he did a respectable job. I mean, Northwestern doesn't have the best pass defense in the league, but he still was, so he was able to take advantage there. And I do think he did a sufficient job in his role. But the person who really wanted over for Nebraska, especially when they were looking to make a comeback, was Amir Abdallah. Yeah, Abdallah. He really showed up big when late in the game. And what it ended up doing is really spreading out this Northwestern defense, where they had to bring their linebackers in to cover the rush, and it opened up the pass game. And it's a shame that for Nebraska that it only worked for a few minutes in the fourth quarter, because that could have led to some very, very good drives. So obviously, this is the outcome of this game is that Northwestern may not go to a bowl at all, and Nebraska is going to the fabled discount double check bowl, as Mike and I always know. But that's really what's going to come of this. So, Mike, come back in and talk about next week.
Okay, so next week, Brian, I'm going to cover the other two M's of the SEC. You're looking at A.J. McCarron and Zach Mettenberger in a matchup of Alabama versus LSU. And this is going to be Alabama's first real test against a really good team in LSU. They haven't really been great this year. You could argue that they've kind of underachieved in a sense. But it's going to be a great game to watch. It's going to be a great chance for McCarron to kind of show off some of that NFL QB type of stuff. So I'm really looking forward to it. What game are you covering?
All right, I'm covering a big game. I mean, we're both in the top 15. I've got Stanford versus Oregon, and I mean, looking at this game, I really do think that it's going to be a true test for this Oregon offense, because the reason Stanford has been able to retain that rank is because, I mean, with the exception of the Utah game, their defense has just been stellar. The most shining example I'd like to see is the UCLA game, where basically Brett Hundley could not throw. They were in his face so much, and that's really sort of a dagger right to the heart of the Oregon offensive attack. So I think what this comes down to is one, can Kevin Hogan show up? Because Gaffney is gonna he shows up almost every week. So you can guarantee that Oregon's going to put some guys on them, and I do think they'll be able to contain them. But also, will the Oregon defense show up and prove that they are a well-rounded top 5 team?
And I definitely think this is a battle that is going to hinge on, I think Alabama's going to be watching this one especially, because if Oregon loses and Stanford wins, then Saban can kind of narrow down his choices between maybe Stanford and Florida State. But if Oregon wins, I think Stanford is effectively knocked out of the BCS championship title contention, not necessarily the Rose Bowl, but I think this is going to be a huge one. This one has, amazing BCS implications for both team, and I think this will be the game to watch Thursday night. Actually, I don't know what the schedule makers were thinking on that one, scheduling such a prime time game for Thursday, and I can guarantee you there will not be a lot of students attending class at Stanford Friday morning, as if the Cardinal can come away with the victory, you can bet that campus will be rocking.
Yeah, and I will be just as happy myself. But, turning it to your game, and I do feel like LSU has sort of been the underdog ever since 2 years ago, when, they're the top 2 teams, and then Alabama came on top and repeatedly, and, Les Miles doesn't get really enough appreciation because he's got that big looming shadow of Nick Saban. And there have been questions about Zach Mettenberger, so I do think that while Alabama may win, this is a huge chance for LSU, for Les Miles and Zach Mettenberger, to show that they are real deal.
Yeah, they're the real deal, and I think LSU definitely playing in the shadow of Alabama and playing in the shadow of Texas A&M. You really wouldn't expect to say that, but you have 2 huge personalities in Nick Saban and in Johnny Manziel, and LSU, not one of those programs that is going to have that huge personality. They're not going to have that electric leader, that amazing Hall of Fame head coach. So I think this is going to be a great game, and if LSU really wants to stick it to Alabama, this is their shot right here.
Yeah, LSU's real job is basically play spoiler right now. I would not approve of them being in any BCS games, not with the losses that they've had, but they are very much like let's see. I see him as like early season Tennessee before their quarterback get injured.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is teams would come into Knoxville, and Tennessee would give them a run for their money, and it would just crush their BCS rank. And I really, and I really do believe that that's really what LSU's playing for right now. And as an Auburn fan, I would love to see that happen. So go Tigers.
Yeah, definitely go Tigers. And on that note, Brian, I'm Mike Carlson.
I'm Brian Heisenbottom.
And this has been The View from the U. We'll see you guys later.
See you next week.